valve disease is poorly studied. Hearts rather have valves that control the blood flow in the heart and ensure that it goes forwards rather than backwards. Some people develop heart valve disease over time, and that can cause problems. However, it's not a very well researched area. Unlike coronary disease, which we know quite a lot about, we don't really know what the extent of the problem in valve disease is, i.e. how many people have it. We also don't know why it progresses, who it progresses in, and in which people it's going to become a problem. So some really simple questions we just don't have answers to. We want to understand the cause of valve disease. Now that's a really difficult thing to try and identify. But what we will be doing for patients is they will come up and have a scan, they'll have an ECG, they'll have a questionnaire about what they do and their quality of life, and fitness trackers, etc. But what we're also taking is blood samples for DNA and also various other biomarkers. And what we want to do is to link those with valve disease and see all their other conditions to see, is there a link, for example, between smoking and valve disease, between other conditions such as your cognitive state, which might be representative of vascular disease, and whether that affects the valves as well. But we're also going to use those blood samples to look at DNA. So we've got various genetic markers that we can explore, see if they're connected, and also blood markers that aren't genes, so various proteins in the blood that might be an indicator for either why valve disease develops in the first place, or even more helpfully, why it progresses. And I'm sure that we'll have, of lots of people with mild valve disease, some will progress and some won't. If we can find markers of why those people have progressed and why those other people haven't, that could be really helpful. The markers don't have to be blood markers, they could also be echo markers. So we do echocardiograms on these patients, and if we find that, let's say, a valve has a particular kind of thickening or a particular degree of calcium that's embedded in the valve, that might be an indicator of future progression. OxValve is a long-term study. We started in 2009 and we've recruited 4,000 patients, so it's a large study as well. In fact, they're not really patients, they're normal people who are out in the community. And one of the specific aims was to identify people in their GP practices or who are registered with their GP who don't have any valve disease that we know about in the first place. So really getting a very good understanding of the spread of valve disease across people who may not have presented with anything beforehand. But it's been going since 2009, so nearly 10 years now, and what we've done is spent the first few years recruiting all those 4,000 patients. Now what we've discovered so far is that valve disease is extremely common. Roughly 50% of people over the age of 65 have valve disease. In fact, we concentrated on the over 65 group because we knew that it was more common in that group. So some form of valve disease occurs in about 50% of the population. The good news is that the majority of that is mild. Only about 5 or 10% have valve disease that's moderate or severe that might be at a level that goes on to become a problem in the future. So the next stage of the project is to take those 4,000 people and follow them up. It's now about 7 or 8 years since they were first scanned. And the next stage of the project is to scan them again and see what their hearts have done over that time and see how likely it is that that mild valve disease 7 or 8 years ago has become moderate or severe disease now, what the chances of that occurring is, and perhaps even more helpfully, can we predict who was likely to develop moderate or severe disease in the future. We'd like to do this again in, say, 5 or 10 years' time from now, and then we'll have an almost 20-year follow-up of these patients, which would be really helpful at understanding how valve disease progresses over that time. One of the other reasons for the study is to look at why valve disease occurs and what the impact of it is. Now, over time, we'll get a really good idea of what the impact is on people, how it affects their lives. And one of the things we're doing in the follow-up stage is looking at their activity with Fitbit monitors, for example, and also self-reported quality of life, both in terms of their activity, but also what they're able to do, their quality of life in all sorts of areas. So we can then correlate that with what the effect of the valve disease is, but also it happens to give us a very good view of quality of life in over 65s in Oxfordshire. Now, some people may think that Oxfordshire is a particularly different place, but in fact it turns out to be exactly representative of the entire UK population. Our ethnic mix, our demographics, our even the wealth of Oxfordshire, if you look at the whole of Oxfordshire, is actually pretty much average for the country. We've already done some work looking at mortality data with NHS Digital and getting statistics from the Office of National Statistics. And what we've learned from this data so far is that people with mild valve disease don't have any difference in their mortality compared to people who have no valve disease, which is probably no great surprise. But those with moderate or severe valve disease do seem to have an increased mortality in those mortality statistics. So we don't, because it's quite crude data, we don't understand exactly why that occurs, but that's the point of OxValve, is we can now look in more detail at what causes that. The two groups of people that benefit most from this study will be firstly patients, and we can reassure patients who have mild disease that this isn't going to be a problem in their lifetime. That saves them the time coming up to clinics, it saves their doctors time in clinics, including GPs for example. They don't need to see patients with mild valve disease, that's an enormous cost saving. We can then focus on the people who do need to be followed up, those with moderate or severe disease, and even better if we can identify those within that group that are likely to progress further, then that's a really efficient way of focusing on those that it's going to matter to. The second group of people who benefit from this are healthcare planners. So if you are NHS England or any of the clinical commissioning groups, anyone thinking strategically about how to use your resources, what you need to know is how much valve disease there is and which parts of it need to be dealt with, because there's a huge difference between having to cope with 50% of the population rather than 5 or 10% of the population, or even better, a smaller proportion of those. If you know which people to focus on, that makes a very big difference to your resources, and you can tailor the resources to precisely the people that need it.